Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's seminar. I want to thank you all for taking time out of your day to be here. The title of today's seminar is Helping You, the Migrant Farm Worker, Have a Healthy Heart. And in Spanish, that translates to Ayudándote a ti, el trabajador agrícola, tener un corazón saludable. I want to begin by giving you a little bit of information about myself. I want to start off with an introduction. And you can see my picture in the upper right-hand part of the slide. My name is Araceli Delgadillo, and currently I am working towards earning a Master's of Science in Applied Nutrition through the University of New England, and I expect to be completed with this degree next year, fall of 2018. I graduated from California State University, Fresno, with a Bachelor's of Science in Food and Nutritional Science with an option in Dietetics. Currently, I work for the University of California Cooperative Extension in Fresno, California, and I am a nutrition program coordinator. And before my current job, I was a degreed nutritionist for United Health Centers of the San Joaquin Valley. So I just want to give you an overview of what you can expect for today's seminar. So first, we're going to talk about our goals and our learning objectives for the seminar. I am going to talk a little bit of, give you a little bit of some background information with regards to the topic that we are going to cover today. We are going to define what heart disease is. We are going to talk about some risk factors in developing heart disease. We will talk about what you need to do in order to not only prevent heart disease, but also to stop the progression of heart disease. And we will end today's seminar, the presentation portion of the seminar, with questions from you, the audience. So what are our goals and learning objectives? What do I want you to walk away with from today's seminar? So first, I am hopeful that you will be able to describe what heart disease is and how it can affect your health. Secondly, I'm hopeful that you will be able to tell the difference between risk factors that you can change and those that you cannot change, and how those can affect the impact of you either developing heart disease or slowing the progression of heart disease. And lastly, I'm hopeful that you will be able to understand what you can do to reduce and also slow the development of heart disease. So let's start off with a little bit of background information. So let's talk a little bit about the heart. So the heart is a muscle in our body, and it supplies nutrients and oxygen-rich blood throughout our body. And the heart makes up, or is a part of, the cardiovascular system, and within the cardiovascular system, you are going to find the heart, like we mentioned, blood vessels, and other blood-forming organs. Now, when I mention heart disease, what exactly does that mean? Well, heart disease describes a range of conditions that affect the heart, like coronary heart disease, heart rhythm problems, heart defects, among others. And usually heart disease is associated with something called atherosclerosis, and we will discuss what atherosclerosis is shortly. So what exactly is heart disease? So over the course of our lifetime, fatty deposits called plaque build up in the artery walls. And in this picture that we have up here on the slide, we have a picture of a normal artery. And as you can see, there's nothing, there's no buildup inside of this artery. And because there is no buildup, blood can flow freely through that artery without any problems. But like I mentioned, over time, fatty deposits can build up, and that in the illustration where it says artery narrowed by plaque, you can see how that plaque builds up inside of the artery. And because of this plaque buildup, it causes the artery to be narrow. and this is called atherosclerosis. And when this happens in the coronary artery, the heart cannot get enough blood, and this is what causes coronary heart disease. So other organs that can be affected by heart disease. So as we see on these two pictures, our brain can also be affected by this plaque buildup, and as a result of that plaque buildup in the brain, we can suffer from something called a stroke. The same way that we have plaque that develops in the arteries of our hearts, it can also happen in the arteries of our legs, and so we see a picture of that, and that is called peripheral artery disease. So I think that it's important that we understand why we should be concerned with developing heart disease. So we're going to talk a little bit about some heart disease statistics. Now, coronary heart disease is the most common form of heart disease in the United States. Heart disease accounts for 23.5% of all deaths in the United States, and men have a greater risk of developing heart disease. And so this is why I think that it's very important that you are here today as attending our seminar. 33% of Hispanic men in the United States suffer from heart disease. All right, so I want to get into some risk factors for developing heart disease. Now, there are, and you'll notice as we progress through the seminar, there are certain risk factors that we have no control of, and there are other risk factors that we do have control of. So, first of all, we're going to touch a little bit on some of those risk factors that we have no control over and we cannot change. So, first of all, one of those risk factors is age. Gender, ethnicity, and family history. So there, as we saw in the previous slide, 33% of Hispanic males suffer from heart disease. And as we get older, we are more likely to suffer from heart disease. And lastly, if we have a history of heart disease in our family, that makes us more likely to develop heart disease. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that we will develop heart disease, but our chances automatically increase. So what are some things that you can change? So there are definitely some things that we can change that can impact the development of heart disease. And so the first one is high blood pressure. So we will, further in the seminar, we will talk about a little bit more about what high blood pressure is. But the second thing that we can change is our diet. And the seminar is going to focus very largely on how we can make changes to our diet that can help us to prevent not only developing heart disease, but also the progression of heart disease. Physical inactivity. So if you are physically inactive, which means that you don't get regular exercise, that puts you at risk for developing heart disease. So, trying to be more physically active is something that we can definitely change. When we smoke, that also increases our chances of developing heart disease. And again, this is something that we have control over. We can control whether we smoke or not. If we are overweight or obese, that again is something that increases the likelihood that we will develop heart disease. And so again, if we, this ties into what I mentioned earlier about our diet. If we can make some changes to our diet, we can potentially have an impact on whether we are overweight or obese. And lastly, high cholesterol. So it has been shown that if you have high levels of cholesterol, you are automatically at a higher risk of developing heart disease. And again, this ties into our diet, right? So if we make changes to our diet, we potentially can have an effect on how high our cholesterol levels are. And one thing that I do want to point at, there are three things on this slide: high blood pressure, being overweight or obese, and high cholesterol, these three factors that can potentially cause us to have heart disease all have to do with our diet. And again, we will talk more about our diet and how we can make some changes that can help us to prevent heart disease. We'll talk more about that as we continue through our seminar. All right, so I want to talk about some tests for heart health. There are definitely some tests that your doctor can order for you, and these tests can determine, are you more at risk for developing heart disease? Okay, so the first test that we're going to talk about is called the LDL, or the bad cholesterol test. And basically, you want this level to be less than 100 milligrams per deciliter. And the reason that this is called the bad cholesterol is because it can build up on your artery walls, and it increases your chances of developing heart disease. The next test that checks for heart health is a triglycerides test. And for this particular test, 150 is high, so we definitely want to have our levels below that. And with triglycerides, what they are is they are the way that fat exists in our body. And when we have too many triglycerides inside of our, circulating in our body, this can be, not such a good thing, right? Because they have been linked to developing heart disease. Triglycerides have been linked to heart disease. All right, so let's talk about HDL. And HDL is actually the good cholesterol. And so when the HDL, this is actually a number that we want to be high. So for this particular heart health test, we would want to see 60 milligrams per deciliter or higher. So when that number falls below 60, that's not necessarily something that we want to see. Again, we want to see a number that's 60 or above. And with this cholesterol, we call it the good cholesterol because it protects against heart disease by taking the bad cholesterol out of our body. And not only does it take the bad cholesterol out of our body, but it does so and it helps it to not build up inside of our arteries, like we saw in some of the previous slides, how that plaque builds up in our arteries, not only in our heart, but also in our brain and also in our legs. And so the HDL, think of it as a good cholesterol. Okay. And I mentioned high blood pressure earlier. So with high blood pressure, first of all, what is our blood pressure? So blood pressure is the force by which blood flows through the artery walls. And so the higher that this number is, the faster that blood is moving through our arteries. And if the number is really high, that means that the blood flow is going very fast through our arteries, and that can potentially damage our arteries. And so we want this number to be low. So ideally we would want for our blood pressure to be 120/80. So anything greater than that is considered to be high blood pressure. Now, I want you to just think about something. Our artery walls are very flexible. Think about them as like a water hose, very flexible. And over time, if we have high blood pressure, over time when our blood flow is traveling so rapidly through our arteries, it can damage them. Okay, and so that is why we want to keep our blood pressure at a normal level. And blood pressure can not only be regulated by our diet, but also by exercising. Okay, that's why being physically active is one of those risk factors that you have control over that can help bring your blood pressure down. Okay. All right, so let's talk about the things that you can change, okay? That's what we want to focus. So it is recommended that we get at least 30 minutes of exercise regularly on most days. Now, I know that your job is very labor intensive. You are out there from very early in the morning to very late at night. And I know that sometimes it can be difficult to include that physical activity in your day. But again, the recommendation is that we exercise for at least 30 minutes a day on most days. We kind of touched a little bit on the second thing that we can change, which is to quit smoking. Now, at the end of our seminar, I am going to give you some handouts, and in one of those handouts that I'm going to give you is a handout that talks about strategies on how we can quit smoking if we smoke, because as we know, if we smoke, our chances of developing heart disease increase. And so I know that smoking can be difficult to quit. So one of those handouts will give you some strategies on how you can stop smoking. The next thing that we have control over is our weight. So maintaining a healthy weight is very important. When you visit your doctor, based on your age, your gender, your height, they can let you know exactly what weight you should be at, and this is considered a healthy weight. So research has shown that the further we are away from that healthy weight, the more likely we are in developing certain chronic conditions, and heart disease being one of them. And lastly, and I think one of, a very, very important thing that you can change is, making changes to your diet. Now, I know that, again, this is another thing that may not necessarily be the easiest, but we will talk about some things that you can do to make some changes in your diet. All right, so what to eat. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this image that we have up on the slide, and this is our My Plate. And eating healthy foods is one of the most important ways to keep your heart healthy. I know that we love our foods that are traditional to our culture, and it can be very difficult to think about changing our ways of eating. And we think that if we make changes to what we're eating, we're not going to be able to eat our traditional meals, but that's not always true. So this plate is definitely a guide to follow. And so if you can see here up on the screen, the recommendation is that half of our plate be fruits and vegetables. Okay. The second recommendation is that 1/4 of our plate be starch, and the other 1/4 be protein. And I know that many times in our Hispanic culture, it's the opposite. Half of our plate is either protein, or sometimes it can be half of the plate being starches. And I know that in many of our traditional Hispanic recipes, fruits and vegetables aren't very prominent, but they are definitely very important for our heart health, and again should make up half of our plate. Okay. If you do notice here, they have a cup with water, and again, I know that in the Hispanic culture, it is so common to have soda be the drink that we drink with meals, and drinking more water is also very important. All right, so we know that if we're making changes into our diet, there are going to be some things that we need to try to eat less of. Now, that doesn't mean that we are going to completely stop eating these things, but definitely trying to be mindful and to try to consume less of them. So the first one is less sugar. And again, I know that, like I mentioned earlier, in our Hispanic culture, it's very common to have soda be our drink of choice, but maybe, again, drinking warm water would be a better suggestion. The second thing that we need to stop or, try to limit is the salt, okay? I know that, again, many of our recipes in the Hispanic culture are very high in salt, right? But trying to find other things that we can substitute for the salt, okay? And the third thing that we should try to eat less of is red meat. And again, I know that that can be very difficult because many of our recipes call for, many of our traditional recipes in the Hispanic culture call for red meat. But towards the end of the presentation, we are going to see how we can possibly substitute red meat for other leaner meats in some of our very common Hispanic recipes. All right, make simple changes to food you choose and how you prepare it. So I know again that when we talk about making changes to our diet, this can seem scary. And what I want to do now is give you some tips on what you can do to make sure that making the healthy choice is a little easier. So you can choose fresh, frozen, or canned fruits and vegetables. So remember, half of our plate should be fruits and vegetables. So you can buy fresh, frozen, or canned fruits. One thing, to keep in mind is if you are buying canned fruits, you want to look for fruits that say light syrup or sugar-free, and it'll say that on the can. If we're buying canned vegetables, we want to look for cans that say low sodium, and sodium and salt are the same thing, but so low sodium would be low salt. Instead of using white bread or white flour tortillas, we can choose whole grain bread or whole grain flour tortillas. And I know that, again, many of our traditional Hispanic recipes call for fats like lard, but we can actually replace the lard with liquid oils. Okay, so these are just a couple of suggestions that I, can make to you to make sure that we're making some healthy changes to our diet. Okay, so make simple changes to food you choose and how you prepare it. So like I mentioned earlier, I know that in our Hispanic traditional recipes, we use a lot of red meat, but using leaner meats like chicken, turkey, or fish is a good strategy because remember, we need to try to limit the amount of red meat that we eat. We can bake, broil, or grill meats instead of frying, and not only our meats, but other dishes that we consume. Instead of frying them, we can bake, broil, or grill them. We want to try to remove the skin and the fat from our meats. I know many people say that the fat gives the meat the flavor, and while that may be true, we need to remember that it's not the best thing for our heart. We want to try to limit beverages and foods that are high in sugar. So this not only includes a soda, but it includes a lot of the sweet pastries, the pan dulces, which are sweet breads that we consume, candies. We really want to try to limit these. And we want to include more fruits and vegetables into meals that you already cook. So it's not about completely changing your recipes, but trying to find ways that you can add more fruits and vegetables. All right, so we know that salt gives our food flavor, but there are other things that we can use instead of salt that can still give our food that flavor. So we can use herbs like cilantro, oregano, thyme, and mint. And I know that in the Hispanic cultures, cilantro and oregano are very commonly used. We can use spices like chili powder, cumin, coriander, and garlic powder. Or we can opt to use fresh garlic, chilies, and onions in our meals for a great flavor. Because remember that salt, while it may flavor our foods, isn't the best thing for our heart, because if we take in excess amounts of salt, that can also elevate our blood pressure. And remember, we want to try to keep that blood pressure under control because it's not the best thing for our heart. So this image that you see here on this slide is our nutrition label, and this food label gives us very important information about the food that we buy. And it is located on many of the products that we eat, usually on the back part of the products that we buy. And this label will help you compare foods. So it will help you to make some healthier choices when it comes to the foods that you buy. Now, the food label can help you limit things like sugar, fat, and cholesterol in our diet. And it can also help us to choose foods that are higher in vitamins and fiber. So if we go ahead and we look at the picture of the nutrition label, the nutrients that you see in blue, which are fats, cholesterol, and sodium, those are the nutrients that we want to try to reduce. So if you pick up a package at the store and you notice that the numbers are very high for fat, cholesterol, and sodium, then it probably isn't the best choice for us to eat and to buy this product. And so we really want to pay close attention to limiting these nutrients. Now again, in the handouts that you will receive at the end of the seminar, you will have another handout that goes into greater detail about the different portions of our food label. All right, so let's talk about food. We know we all love food, and what I'm going to show you are 3 recipes that are very common in our Hispanic culture, and basically they're the same recipe but with a little twist. Okay, so let's look at this recipe here. This is a chili chicken pozole, and up on the slide you will see the different ingredients that are needed for this recipe. Now, one thing that I want to highlight is that usually when we make pozole, it is not chicken pozole. We usually use pork, and we know that pork is a red meat that is higher in fat. And again, the red meat was one of those foods that we want to try to limit. And so we can still enjoy the pozole, but instead of using a meat that is higher in fat like the pork, we can use the chicken. So all of the other ingredients are pretty much the same. So the only thing that is changing is just the meat that we are using. So again, this is just to show you that just because we're making some healthier changes in our diet, that doesn't mean that we don't get to enjoy all of those yummy and delicious meals that we still like to eat. Next is tamales, right? We're approaching Christmas season. We know that tamales are usually the meal that is prepared for Christmas and also for New Year's Eve. And so usually, again, with tamales, not only do we use red meats, but we also have the option of using those leaner meats that we talked about, using the chicken, using turkey. And one big difference that you'll see in the ingredients for these tamales is instead of using lard is, what we use to make tamales, we will be using vegetable oil. And if you recall earlier in our seminar, we talked about limiting the use of fats that are solids like lards and changing them out for liquid oils such as vegetable oil. And believe me, in my family, we have made that change to our tamales recipe, and the dough is still fluffy. You honestly can't tell the difference, but sometimes I know that we're a little hesitant, right, to make those changes, but the taste is not compromised. Next, we have albóndigas, which is a very common soup, right? That this is a perfect recipe to include more vegetables in. And usually, again, with the albóndigas, it's a meatball soup. Essentially, that's what it is. And the meatballs are used, usually made with ground turkey. With ground beef. And so, again, the ground beef is one of those red meats that we should really try to limit. And so with these, the modification for this recipe is instead of using the ground beef for the albóndigas or the meatballs, we can use ground turkey. We can use ground chicken. So again, some of the other ingredients, they don't change. The only thing that changes is, what type of meat we're using. And why should we care? I know that today I have presented a lot of information to you, and perhaps you're thinking, what does this matter to me? But we all have families. We all have people that depend on us, and you have to think about them. You have to think about, how they are depending on you. And you should also, think about this for yourself, right? Being healthy, being around for your family members for a long time. And that is really the point of this seminar, is to really help you move towards making some healthier changes in your life that can potentially affect whether you develop heart disease or slow the progression of it if you already have it. And again, look at these pictures. You know, it's all about those people that love us and that care for us, and they are why we should care. All right, and if we don't have any questions from the audience, we will move on. And I want to thank you all again for your time.